name is PJ Oates. I'm a professor here at Stanford. I've been here 19 years, and I run a research lab in immunology and rheumatology, and run a number of different educational initiatives for medical students here at Stanford, and I'm a graduate at Stanford in 1991.
Well, yeah, thank you. I just want to start off by, thanking you for having me here in your office and inviting me and taking the time of your day to have this talk.
Sure.
And just kind of jumping into it for the first question, do you mind kind of telling us about your childhood, your background, and any kinds of like educational obstacles you faced and how you overcame them?
Sure. I was born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is the home of the TV show The Office. And I had parents who did not go to college. My mother did graduate high school. She was the valedictorian. My dad did not graduate high school. He ended up getting an equivalency degree after World War II was over. And both of them were really advocates for going to college and making sure that I got a solid education. My dad was an automotive machinist, and so we never had a lot of money. My dad never made more than $25,000 in any year. Then I ended up going to a public high school called North Pocono High School, of which no more than 15 to 30 of the students in a class of 300 went to college. The vast majority of us did not go to college. I ended up going to King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and I had a full scholarship to go there, which was great, and graduated in 1986, and then went to Stanford for medical school in 86.
That sounds incredible. And kind of by the same vein, so for students that are also from low-income backgrounds, that are minorities in STEM, or even members of the LGBTQ+ community that don't see a lot of people like themselves in medical fields or even research fields, what kind of advice do you have for them in terms of why they should go and pursue the medical field or research fields?
Well, medical research is spectacularly interesting. You have a lifelong career. It is intellectually one of the most stimulating and fulfilling careers that you can have. And then to answer your question about running into other people or role models in academia who might be LGBTQ or low income or have come from a disadvantaged background, or be an underrepresented minority, or be a woman, or having a disability, whether it's a visible disability or an invisible disability. Students won't realize this, but they're surrounded by people like that. There are a lot of people who have had to overcome enormous obstacles to get here and are highly successful. I think they have a chip on their shoulder as a result and end up being even more successful. And you can look at pro athletes as being similar. Look at somebody like Draymond Green, who was drafted in the second round and came from a poor family in Saginaw, Michigan. There are people who have to overcome a lot in order to get to where they are, and then he plays basketball with a chip on his shoulder all the time, gets a lot of technicals, but he's successful.
Yeah. I mean, that's really encouraging to hear that like a lot of the times the adversity you face during childhood ends up being something that fuels your success later on. So.
Oh, absolutely. When I was in medical school in particular, I was surrounded by brilliant people, some of whom came from very wealthy backgrounds. Others who came from a background much like my own, and one of the questions was, am I going to be able to be as good as somebody who went to Harvard or Yale or Stanford when I went to King's College and grew up in Scranton? Not even in Scranton, I was in the Pocono Mountains, and I soon discovered that I was just as talented and definitely harder working than they were, and have done just as well as any of them. So I think you have to get into that environment and then show that you can be just as good as anyone else. I think it also makes it easier to care for patients from poor, disadvantaged backgrounds. When you come from a background that's similar to that, you can understand what they're having to go through and just provides more empathy.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of along the same lines, so as a subset of that, of students that do come from challenged backgrounds that do want to attend college but can't due to like the tremendous cost and accruing student debt, what kind of advice would you have for them as to how they should kind of approach that?
Oh, there's lots of colleges that ways to do that. So you have community colleges. A lot of students now will start off in community college either for a lot of reasons. Sometimes they want to be closer to home. Sometimes they don't have the funding, and community colleges are much cheaper, in some cases free, and then transfer to a four-year college. Some students just want to grow up a little bit more and spend a little bit more time just getting a frontal lobe that's better developed. That's one approach. The other is that a lot of colleges and universities will offer need-based scholarships. Stanford's a great example of that. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head in terms of what the income levels need to be, but Stanford gives out a huge number of full scholarships to students who fall below a particular income level. And so I think as a student, you should always set your sights as high as possible, try to get into a school that's a really good match, and then work on the finances. I would never not apply to a school because I didn't think I could afford it. You can always come up with some way to get to be able to fund it.
And kind of like as a nuance on that question, so what about students that are in middle income families? So they don't exactly qualify for a lot of the need-based scholarships, but at the same time they do have issues at home, like situationally based, like if you have a parent undergoing surgery, or if you have other siblings you want to send to college, which might preclude them from even wanting to apply or potentially going.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Middle income families fall into a very challenging group now because here in the Bay Area, a middle income family might be somebody who's making $150,000 a year, which sounds like a lot, but it's challenging to pay a mortgage and all the other things that you need to pay here in the Bay Area given the costs. So I think in those cases, students probably need to think a little bit more about things like financial aid, trying to earn scholarships that are merit-based scholarships, athletic scholarships. That's another really big thing that students are now doing. And then just realizing that it's possible to take out loans to pay for college. The other thing to think about too is things like the armed forces or payback opportunities. It's the same in medical school. In medical schools, we often will tell students or remind students that if they work in a rural area or if they work in an inner city or do international work, or if they do research, there are loan repayment programs that exist that can pay back the debt. So again, for the I feel like middle income students are really, those families are challenged in ways that perhaps the low income students are not. But in the United States, the vast majority of people who are eligible to go to college are actually going to be financially disadvantaged. They're not going to be the middle income students.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of maybe taking a step back from this whole college process and thinking a little bit more about the education that comes up to college and broadening the scope just from like the US towards international communities. So JMA personally, we work with a lot of international communities that I know we were talking about earlier in terms of in a lot of rural villages in Pakistan, Zimbabwe, Democratic Republic of the Congo. And one big thing that I've noticed as I've visited some of these locations is that in a lot of these rural communities, education is very highly prized, and a lot of people want the education and they want to succeed from the education. There's a huge lack of educational opportunities for them, a fundamental lack of physical material or teachers in the area to go and impart those modalities of knowledge. So what do you think can be done just in general to increase this access of education towards communities in these kind of rural regions?
That's an enormous challenge. So some of that is political. It really has to come from the government to really try to change how they deliver their education. Some of it could be done by having online education that can be provided. That of course assumes that the people who are going to receive that have access to computers and internet and wireless. The other would be things like a folding microscope that was invented here at Stanford to be able to provide that to students, along with similar sorts of things that can be done for pennies on the dollar. I guess the last would be trying to engage philanthropy and venture philanthropy. Seems to be a particularly hot new area, not that new, but a hot area for trying to get people who are wealthy to really pour money into education and research in countries that would ordinarily have that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a really interesting idea. Like for us personally in JMA, what we've had is more of like a inside-out process where it's kind of work within the system. Right. So like to give you an example, like in Zimbabwe, a huge challenge we faced is that like rural communities there, the issue was that the students there, one, they spoke Shona, which was a native tongue. They didn't speak English, and two, they didn't have access to internet, so they did not have any Wi-Fi whatsoever. And our curriculum was entirely in English and only online. Right. So the way we kind of addressed that was we did a student spillover model where we met with a lot of the secondary school students in local capitals like Harare, and they were bilingual, so they spoke Shona and English, and they were walking distance away from these kind of students in rural communities, and they had access to internet. So we kind of opened up clubs there. We had them learn from the curriculum, own the curriculum, and then modify it with their own kind of, to match their own nationality, ethnicity, anecdotes, etc. And then they went and taught these students in these rural communities, and that's how we're reaching out to our 100 targeted schools there.
That's a phenomenal work, really impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that might be kind of an interesting approach for a lot of nonprofit organizations out there, or organizations that try to spread the love of education, particularly maybe even next steps for Simmer or something like that.
Yeah.
And that might be a nice segue to talk a little bit about Simmer. So you're the founder of the Stanford Institute of Medical Research, informally known as Simmer. So do you mind kind of telling us how the story of its conception, why'd you found it, its core mission, what you aim to do with Simmer?
Yeah, so it was founded in summer of 1999. I had 3 high school students working in my lab, funded by the Arthritis Foundation. Looked around, realized there were a bunch of students working as volunteers and not having any safety training at all, which was not a good thing. And then just decided to organize and give them lectures, and then the next year had a competition, and then it's grown over the years. It started off in immunology, now it expanded to multiple different disciplines. The goal is to get students into research labs for 8 weeks, and the focus is on students who are disadvantaged or underrepresented in science or medicine. And right now we have about 50 or so students in the program who work for 8 weeks, and they're typically have just finished their junior year. That's how it started and how it got going. Where it's going to go next is unclear. So next year will be year 20, and we're going to write everything up that we've done so far. One of the things I'd like to see would be to replicate it around the country, but that takes a lot more time and infrastructure than I have to be able to do right now, but it's something I'm hoping to be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be truly incredible for a lot of students, not just in California, but the U.S. and maybe internationally as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just as a kind of last question, so yeah, we've talked a lot about students from underrepresented backgrounds and challenged neighborhoods, whether it's rural communities in Uganda or in communities just low income that are in California.
Yeah.
So we kind of discussed earlier, for these students a big challenge is that they come from communities without access to private tutors, AP courses, or they might be having to work side jobs as opposed to being able to study. Mm-hmm. So for these students, it seems kind of hard to go and apply to a lot of universities, top tier universities like Stanford, and there comes this perpetuation of this kind of stereotype that the only students that go to Stanford are either really privileged and elitist, or they had the periodic table memorized as they exited the womb, so to speak. So as someone that's been working with some of the brightest minds of the nation and possibly even the world, what do you think is a common thread amongst a lot of your top students, aside from intelligence or monetary capacity, that leads to their success?
I would say it's hard work. They outwork everybody else. Mm. So the students who end up coming to Simmer, you can just see it in their applications. There are people who have a chip on their shoulder. There are people who may not have the resources to be able to take a lot of AP courses, or maybe there's not even AP courses at their schools. But then they come here, they get the confidence that they can hang out with grad students who might be from Harvard or Stanford or Yale or wherever as undergrads, and realize they're just as good as them. So I would say that's probably the thing that most defines them. In terms of I'll say 2 other things to end. One is that financially, so what we've done, we built a model where our students, we realized that there were students who came here or wanted to come here and got accepted to the program and would turn us down because they had to work other jobs. They just couldn't make enough money. So we've come up with a model where we have philanthropists who provide enough funding that we can pay students who really need it much more money so that they can do this and not have to work other jobs. And then the other thing I'll say is that, at least for Stanford, for Stanford undergrads, I should know the number off the top of my head, but it's a really strikingly high proportion of students who get a full ride or get full tuition paid, but have to just pay their room and board, and they can do work study and things like that to pay for that. So it used to be that this place, and a lot of the elite schools are just viewed as places where rich people would go, but I think now it's definitely, these schools are really not that. In fact, a lot of the really wealthy people around the world are rebelling a little bit, saying, well, wait a minute, my son or daughter has perfect SATs and a GPA of 4.6, but they didn't get in. And I think Stanford is a shining example of a university that really prides itself on trying to create opportunities for people who ordinarily wouldn't have that opportunity.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for your time. That's extremely promising.
Sure.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.